So we're ready to look at the things that we need to do before we start a primer construction. So we call this beginning considerations. We're looking at primarily Chapter 4 and Appendix F of the primer guide in this section. So we're going to look at some things, including count the cost or the budget, consider the context for the primer, the initial work agreement. And then later on in another video, we'll be looking at the advanced preparations that need to happen and what happens during the primer workshop, and then what we do with the primer itself. First, we're going to talk a little bit about steps in developing a primer. You can find this on page 18 of your primer guide, a little chart that's there. And in general, we say that a primer, new primer from start to finish can take a minimum of 4 to 6 months to develop, and on average, it takes around a year. And this is because first you have the advanced preparations, which we'll talk about in detail later. And this can take from 1 to 5 months to do. So you have over 200 pages of translation, things that need to be translated. And this can take a bit of time depending on who you can find. We also have then the next phase of it is the actual primer construction workshop, where you're working with a team to develop the 82 lessons needed for the two-book series. And this includes the writing of those lessons, as well as the checking of the manuscript draft. And this generally takes 2 to 3 weeks, although we're leaning more towards 3 weeks now. Then once that workshop is done, you have the time for desktop publishing. And so the materials go into be put on the computer. Sometimes that's done roughly in the workshop, but then it has to be fine-tuned. And depending on how much work has to be done with that, that can take up to a month to get it onto the computer. And then we have the follow-up and testing and editing that goes on. And so they're kind of a cycle that we go through here in the desktop publishing and checking until everybody is satisfied. Once that happens, then it is time to send the camera-ready copy to the printer, where it's printed and then ready for launching. So that whole process, as I said, can take anywhere from 4 to 6 months up to a year. But before you even begin that process, it's always good to, as Jesus says, count the cost. How much is this going to cost? And if you're the one who is requesting a primer to be done, then this means that your organization is responsible for finding the funding for the primer workshop, the advanced preparation, things that need to happen, as well as the printing. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to initial work agreement. But just as a kind of a general ballpark, now numbers will vary depending upon the country, but we're looking at, these are the items that you need to consider when you're looking at a primer workshop. You're looking at the advanced preparations, the cost of translating those materials that need to be translated ahead of time. And so these are US dollars here, about 212 US dollars, about $1 a page or so, depending on the country and how much you need to pay the translator. Lodging for the primer construction team. So where is the workshop going to take place? We'll talk more about that later, but you have to consider the cost for that. So say 3 translators, writers, local language people, 2 LEI staff, and maybe 1 other person to help with logistics. So you'll have the cost of wherever they're staying, times the number of people, times the number of days. We're calling it 3 weeks. So about 958 US dollars. You have meals if they're staying in a location like a guest house. So breakfast, lunch, dinner, ballpark, let's say $767. The hall where they're working, if there's a charge for that. What do you need for the stationery? Pencils, paper, printer ink, all those kinds of things. If you need Wi-Fi, $127. Travel, bus and taxi fares from the home to the PC venue, depending on where your writers are staying, $171. And then you may want to give an honorarium to the local language writers that are part of the team. And then there's always contingency. So a total for the primer construction workshop of $3,330. Then we have to consider the typesetting of the primers. Now, literacy and evangelism helps with the typesetting. So this is a cost you may not have to have, but you need to consider that it may be something that you have to have. Then the initial printing, we recommend printing a smaller amount to start with, just to fine tune them and make sure there's no glaring mistakes, even though we've looked them over many times. So 50 book copies of each book to start, let's say average of $2 per book. So that's $2,000 for your printing, total of $3,000. And then you have the primer workshop. So you have the primer workshop, you have the initial printing, and then to launch the primer, you may want to have some kind of special celebration or thing. So $500 for that. And then your first training workshop of training teachers with that primer, let's say around $1,000. So your total is about $8,330 US that the local organizing group will be responsible for. So this is no small amount, but when you consider the costs of, primer construction versus like setting up a medical hospital or something like that, then literacy, particularly with volunteer teachers and through the local churches, is a much lower cost ministry opportunity. Now, the other thing we want to think about before we start is the context. Where are these primers going to be used? Who will they be used with? So you want to consider, what are the literacy needs in my area? What is the script? Is there scripture in print? If there's not, then literacy and evangelism probably isn't the group to go to first, because we don't do Bible translation. But if there is some scripture in print, then we can help. Are there any other literacy materials available in that language? Even, school, for the school children, or the primers that have been done with another group. So all those things can be helpful in developing our Bible content literacy primers. And who will be the literacy ministry coordinator for that group? It's good to have a point person, somebody who can help organize things and can do follow-up and can help be the trainer for teachers and those kinds of things. And how will the primer workshop and printing be funded? As we mentioned, the local group is responsible for the funding for the primer workshop and for the printing of the materials and the running of the literacy. So that through it's one of the local churches, or whether you get grants, other kinds of things like that, those are things that have to be considered. So where is the language primarily spoken? This will kind of affect how you work with the team to write stories. Is it a rural setting, a nomadic setting? Is it a city setting? Where is the predominant group that you will be working with, and how do you want the primers to focus on them? What's the religious context of the area? Is it predominantly Christian, Muslim, Hindu, animist? So what's the local place? Who are you going to be working with as you teach people to read and write? And this context, whether city, rural, what religious context we might be in, can affect the choices that we make in terms of the health stories and the Bible stories. And we'll talk more about that in the module 2 in the nuts and bolts of primer construction. But just know that those things will affect how we go forward with health and Bible stories, as well as the stories that the language writers write. So usually we used to only have 26, but now we have 36 Bible stories, 13 Old Testament and 23 New Testament. And if it's a very volatile Muslim context, sometimes we also have 23 Old Testament stories that we can use instead of adding in the New Testament stories. So the New Testament stories would be in a separate book that the learners can choose to use or not. And we also, the religious context and the context can affect how we introduce Bible content during workshops. Normally we introduce Jesus in lesson 12 and have some kind of short Bible information content in the following lessons till we get to the 36 Bible stories. But if it's a high Muslim context, sometimes we'll introduce only Old Testament content, and sometimes lesson 12, or maybe we might wait a bit later. It just kind of depends. We work with the group so that the materials can be used well and wisely, but always with some Bible content. And then the other thing you have to find out is what are the health topics needed for the group? Are they primarily agrarian group? Are they primarily in the city? I know one group we worked with, we have a health story on how to build latrines. And the missionary said there's absolutely no reason to have that health story because we've been working with them on 20 years on how to build latrines, and nobody wants to build a latrine. So we took that story out, and instead we put in a story on how to treat cuts and burns, because there was a lot of times machete cuts in the areas where they were, and a lot of people falling into or getting burned by the open fires. So we took out the latrine and we put in one that was more appropriate for their context. So just a reminder that for literacy and evangelism to assist a group in developing a primer, there has to be some Bible content in the primer. We can vary how that works, but if they want a primer with no Bible content, then they can use our methodology, but we will not be the ones assisting them. So then let's talk about, okay, you've looked at all these things and you say, yes, we want to go ahead with developing an LAI primer. So then we asked that the sponsoring group would fill out an initial work agreement. And this just kind of lays out what both parties are going to be doing. So you can find this on pages 17 to 19 of your primer guide. And so initially we just have filling out some basic data so that we can keep in contact with the group that's requesting our help with a primer. And so you can just see the sponsoring group invites literacy and evangelism in writing and with the initial work agreement. And then LAI will coordinate with the sponsoring group for a mutually convenient time to hold a primer workshop. The sponsoring group assigns someone to complete the advanced preparation packets. LAI has sent the advanced preparation packet ahead of time. The sponsoring group will recruit local language speakers to be on the primer construction team to work with LAI consultants. LAI will arrange for primer consultants, either from North America or from one of our member nation groups that have been trained to come and facilitate and lead the primer construction team. The sponsoring group will provide the cost of the local primer construction team, room, board, and transportation costs in country for LAI consultant, materials needed by the primer construction team. LAI will provide transportation costs between the country of origin and the country where the primer is going to be developed. We used to almost always be from North America, but now we have primer consultants trained in various parts of the world. So depending on where they're coming from, they will be assisted. The sponsoring group arranges for funding for the printing of the complete primer series, but they agreed to send 5 sets of the primer to LAI, our headquarters in the USA, so that we can keep a file of all the primers developed. Now, LAI does say, remember we had about $1,000 there for desktop publishing costs. Well, Literacy and Evangelism will help provide digital copies of the primers, will provide desktop publishing, and will provide final camera ready copy for printing to the sponsoring group. So that basically saves you about $1,000 off your budget. The sponsoring group agrees to make the primers available to any group in their country who wants to use them at a reasonable cost. And as soon as the material is ready, to make it available to your literacy coordinator for the training of teachers. LEI provides follow-up tutor training and trainer of trainers, trainer of teacher training, and future revision help if requested. Now, just a note that while we did have in our budget honorarium for the local language writers, that the LEI team facilitators do not ask for an honorarium. If you were to have a professional consultant come in to do what LEI does, oftentimes they will charge you several $1,000s for that privilege. But this is our ministry gift, our service to the Lord. So we don't ask for an honorarium or reimbursement for our voluntary consulting services. We simply ask for room, board, and transportation within the country once we arrive, and that we would be able to serve you in this way. So that concludes our video about this part of the beginning considerations, where we looked at the budget and the context and the literacy initial work agreement. And so we'll go on to look more about the Primer workshop in another video.